The choosing hall had the specific quality of all spaces in the Velthari Empire that had been built for a function, and that had been performing that function long enough for the function to be present in the architecture. The warm, particular weight of a space that understood what it was for, and that communicated the understanding in the way that spaces did when they had been what they were for long enough. The Bilateral Commission's Cultural Record Protocol had assigned the Vaeylen choosing to the Decade Archiving queue with the flat, administrative notation that all significant Velthari cultural ceremonies received. The Cultural Record Office's scheduling, the Documentation Officer's assignment, the departure date, and the logistics and the preparation materials. He had read the preparation materials. The Vaeylen choosing was the Velthari Empire's ancient ceremonial rite of the heir, a parent's formal presentation to the assembled eligible candidates, not the administrative arrangement of a marriage in the institutional sense, but the specific, cultural rite of a civilization that understood the distinction between arranging and recognizing. The distinction was real, and it mattered to the Velthari cultural architecture in the specific, particular way that things that were the product of centuries of considered practice mattered. Not because someone had designed the distinction, but because the civilization had, across its history, arrived at the understanding that the distinction was the difference between a ceremony that meant something and a ceremony that performed meaning. The candidates were the empire's eligible males from the significant families, the noble house's most qualified representatives, the military command's senior officers at the appropriate standing. The specific, organized weight of the Velthari social architecture's assembled significance gathered in the choosing hall for the specific function that the rite required of them. He was at the documentation margin. The documentation margin was the choosing hall's western position, the Bilateral Commission's Cultural Record Protocol's designated location for the documentation officer. Chosen for the complete sightlines it provided to the choosing hall's primary elements, and for its position at the formal occasion's functional edge, where the documentation function could be performed without being in the ceremony's formal geography. He had set up the recording equipment with the thorough, organized attention that the Commission's archival standards required. He had verified the notation system. He had checked the translation interface. The Vaeylen choosing used both the working register and the ancient register, and the ancient register's formal elements required the translation interface's specific preparation. The choosing hall was filling with the organized quality of a significant ceremony, receiving its assembled elements. Princess Vaeylen entered at the ceremony's formal time with the composed, present quality of someone who was in the full register of a significant occasion, and who was, in the register, completely present to what the occasion was rather than to the performance of the occasion. She was 24. She had the attending quality, the complete, undistributed reception of what was in front of her, present in the way that the royal family's specific characteristic was present, as a genuine condition rather than a performed one. He documented her entrance with the professional notation of someone recording a ceremony's primary element. He noted the attending quality, the composed presence, the specific, particular quality of someone who had been prepared for this occasion with thoroughness, and who was, in the occasion, being present to what it actually was rather than what the preparation described. He returned to the full notation sequence. The candidates were in their formal positions, the choosing hall's organized geography communicating what the Velthari social architecture required it to communicate. The family's standing, the candidates' qualifications, the assembled significance of the empire's most eligible representatives present for the rite's function. The rite would begin when the princess walked the formal path. He prepared the recording equipment's primary sequence. He verified the notation system's archival categories. He was ready to document the ceremony. The formal path began. The Vaeylen choosing's formal path had the specific, ancient quality of a rite that had been walked for 300 years, and that had, in the walking, developed the particular character of things that were what they were because the civilization they belonged to had determined, across 3 centuries of practice, that this was what they were. The path moved through the choosing hall's organized geography in the sequence that the rite's structure required, from the hall's formal entrance, through the assembled candidates' positions, to the hall's center where the rite's formal acknowledgement occurred. Each candidate occupied a position on the path's route. Each candidate, as the heir apparent passed, had the formal opportunity of the declaration. He documented the path's progress with the professional notation of someone recording a ceremony's sequence, the positions, the declarations, the formal elements of the rights structure. The first candidate, the noble house of Sorvith-Vel's senior representative, the family's most qualified eligible male, whose standing in the Vaethari social architecture was the standing that the choosing hall's organized geography communicated as significant. He made the declaration in the formal register. The declaration had the quality of the correct performance, the appropriate language, the appropriate posture, the appropriate register of someone executing the right's formal requirement. She received it with the attending quality. He noted, first candidate declaration, formal register, quality, correct performance. The second candidate, the military command's senior representative, the Frontier Security Force's most decorated eligible officer, whose record in the Eastern Sector had produced the specific, earned quality of genuine military achievement. He made the declaration. She received it. He noted, second candidate declaration, formal register, quality, correct performance. The third candidate, the noble house of Vaeylen's senior representative, the family whose standing in the Vaethari social architecture was the standing that placed them at the choosing hall's most significant position. He made the declaration. She received it. He noted, third candidate declaration. The fourth candidate, the noble house of Cael's senior representative, the family whose military history and social standing made their representative one of the choosing's most significant candidates by the Vaethari social architecture's logic. He did not make the declaration. He noted, fourth candidate, no declaration. He noted it with the flat, honest quality of the documentation function, what occurred in the order it occurred. The fifth candidate, no declaration. The sixth, declaration, formal register, correct performance. The seventh, no declaration. The eighth, no declaration. He was notating the ninth candidate's position when he became aware, in the attending quality that the documentation function had developed into a professional habit, that the pattern was not random. The candidates who were not making the declaration were not the candidates whose social standing was insufficient or whose qualifications were marginal. The candidates who were not making the declaration were the significant candidates, the ones whose family position and military record and social standing made them the candidates whose declaration would have carried the most weight in the empire's social architecture. The pattern was, the more significant the candidate, the less likely the declaration. He noted this in the notation with the honest, flat quality of someone recording what the documentation showed. He had been in the Vaethari Empire's working sessions long enough to have developed the specific, ground-level understanding that the cultural documentation function required. The understanding of what the Vaethari social architecture's actual logic was rather than the administrative description of what it was. The attending quality was the royal family's characteristic. The attending quality received what it received with the complete, genuine quality of someone who was actually present to the content. The significant candidates understood this. The significant candidates had determined, in the understanding, that the attending quality's complete reception of the declaration was the specific, particular risk that their social standing made unacceptable. The attending quality would receive the declaration accurately. The accurate reception was the risk. He noted this. He continued documenting the path's progress. The 10th candidate, no declaration. The 11th, no declaration. The 12th. Declaration, formal register, correct performance. The pattern continued. At the 14th candidate, Commander Vaeylen Sorvith's brother, whose military record and family standing placed him at the choosing hall's most significant position, the pattern produced its most visible instance. He was in the correct position. He had the correct qualifications. The choosing hall's organized geography had communicated his standing with the full weight that the social architecture assigned to it. He did not make the declaration. The silence had a quality. The specific, particular quality of a significant candidate in a significant position, making a specific choice about what the accurate reception of his declaration would produce in someone with the attending quality, and deciding that the choice was not to make the declaration. He noted 14th candidate, no declaration. He continued. The path was approaching the hall's western side. The documentation margin was at the hall's western position. He was at the documentation margin. The path would reach the documentation margin. He was noting the 16th candidate's position when the understanding arrived, not in the dramatic, sudden quality of a realization, but in the honest, attending quality of someone who had been documenting a pattern and who had, in the documenting, assembled the picture the pattern made. The formal path's route through the choosing hall's organized geography continued past all the candidates' positions and ended at the hall's western side. The documentation margin was at the hall's western side. He looked at the path's route. He looked at the documentation margin. He was at the documentation margin. He continued notating. The formal path had the specific, ancient quality of 3 centuries of walking, and it moved through the choosing hall's organized geography with the unhurried, composed quality of someone who had been walking it for the full duration, and who was, in the walking, being present to what the walking produced. He was documenting. He was at the notation system with the professional, attending quality of someone for whom the ceremony's elements were the documentation's content, and the documentation was the work, and the work was what required the attention. He was noting the 18th candidate's position, the final candidate in the choosing hall's formal geography before the path reached the hall's western side, when the 18th candidate did not make the declaration. He noted, 18th candidate, no declaration. He looked at the path. The path had reached its penultimate position. The penultimate position was the last candidate's location. The choosing hall's formal geography had placed the candidates in the sequence that the right structure required, and the sequence ended at the position just before the hall's western side. The last candidate made the declaration in the formal register with the quality of correct performance. She received it with the attending quality. He noted, 19th candidate, declaration, formal register, quality, correct performance. The path continued, to the hall's western side, to the documentation margin. He was holding the notation stylus. She stopped in front of him. The choosing hall had the specific, collective quality of a significant ceremony that had been in the organized sequence of its ancient rite, and that had arrived at a moment outside the rite's expected formal content. The specific, particular quality of an assembled gathering that was receiving something it had not prepared for, and that was, in the receiving, holding the breath that significant gatherings held when something significant and unexpected was occurring. She looked at him with the attending quality, the complete, undistributed reception of what was in front of her, not the formal diplomatic reception of a sovereign occasion assessing a diplomatic representative, not the managed observation of a princess in a ceremony managing the ceremony's formal elements, but the specific, particular quality of someone who was actually looking at what they were looking at and receiving it with the full, honest attention of the attending mode. He received her looking with the honest, direct attention of someone who was at the documentation margin with the recording equipment and the notation system and the professional quality of someone doing the work, and who was, in the receiving, being present to what was in front of him. The notation stylus was in his hand. The recording equipment was running. The notation system was active. The choosing hall was very quiet. She said, in the direct, honest register of the working mode rather than the ancient register of the formal rite. You've been documenting the ceremony. Yes, he said, the Bilateral Commission's cultural record protocol, she said. Yes, he said. The decade archiving assignment, she said. Yes, he said. The Vaeylen choosing's documentation for the Commission's cultural archive. She held his gaze with the attending quality. You've been documenting the path, she said. Yes, he said. The candidates, she said. The declarations. Yes, he said. The pattern, she said. He held her gaze. Yes, he said. She was quiet for a moment in the attending quality, the specific, genuine quality of someone who was receiving what they were looking at with the full, honest attention of the mode. The significant candidates, she said. The pattern is in the notation, he said. The documentation records what occurred. And what occurred, she said, is that the candidates whose declaration would have carried the most weight did not make the declaration. Yes, he said, because the attending quality, she said. The accurate reception, he said. She held his gaze. The attending quality receives what it receives accurately, she said. Yes, he said. And the significant candidates determined, she said, that the accurate reception was the risk they would not take. Yes, he said. The choosing hall was very quiet around them in the specific, collective quality of an assembled, significant gathering that was present to something it did not have a complete framework for, and that was, in the absence of the complete framework, attending to what was occurring with the full, collective attention of people who understood that what was occurring was significant. She looked at him for a moment in the attending quality. She said, the Vaeylen choosing's formal rite. Yes, he said, has a structure, she said. Yes, he said. The path moves through the assembled candidates, she said. Each candidate has the formal opportunity of the declaration. Yes, he said. The path has reached the documentation margin, she said. Yes, he said. The documentation margin, she said, is at the hall's western side. Yes, he said, which is where the formal path ends, she said. He held her gaze. Yes, he said. She was quiet for a moment. You're at the documentation margin, she said. Yes, he said. The Bilateral Commission's Cultural Documentation Officer, she said. Yes, he said. In the function of the Decade Archiving Assignment, she said. Yes, he said. Recording the ceremony, she said. Yes, he said. She held his gaze with the attending quality. She asked the question. The question was in the ancient register, the Vaeylen choosing's formal language, the specific, particular words of the rite's structure at the point where the formal path reached its end. The translation interface's secondary display carried the words in standard, which the recording equipment captured, and which he understood without the display because 14 years of bilateral corridor work had produced the specific, accumulated knowledge of the Vaeylen cultural architecture that made the ancient register's formal elements legible to someone who had been present to them, with the attending quality across the decades' documentation assignments. The question was, is the one before me the one I have been walking toward? The choosing hall was very quiet. He held the notation stylus. He held her gaze. He did not manage his response. He did not perform the appropriate register of a person in a significant ceremony organizing their answer for the assembled significance. He did not hesitate in the specific, managed way of someone constructing the diplomatic version of what they were going to say. He said yes. One word. In standard, not the ancient register, not the formal diplomatic register. The direct, honest register of someone who had assessed the situation with the same honest, attending mode he gave everything and who had arrived at the answer that the honest assessment produced. The choosing hall received the answer in the specific, collective quality of a significant ceremony that had arrived at an outcome it was not prepared for. Not unprepared in the sense of the outcome being wrong, in the sense of the ceremony's assembled significance not having the framework for an outcome that had this specific quality, which was the quality of something that was true before it was said, and that the saying confirmed rather than produced. He was aware of the choosing hall's collective response in the peripheral awareness of someone who was at the documentation margin with the recording equipment running and the notation system active and who was, in the awareness, doing the honest thing of continuing to be where he was and what he was. She held his gaze with the attending quality, the full, undistributed reception of what she was looking at. She said in the working register, the documentation. Running, he said, the notation system, she said. Active, he said. The recording equipment, she said. Yes, he said. She looked at the notation stylus in his hand. He looked at it. The archival reference for the Vaeylen choosing, he said. The Commission's Decade Archiving Protocol. Yes, she said. The documentation will be filed within 60 days, he said. The Commission's standard archival timeline. The documentation, she said, will include the formal path's complete sequence. Yes, he said. The candidates, the declarations, the pattern, the formal path's conclusion. The formal path's conclusion, she said. Yes, he said. She was quiet for a moment in the attending quality. The pattern, she said. The significant candidates. In the notation, he said. The documentation records what occurred. The accurate reception, she said. The risk they determined they would not take. Yes, he said. She held his gaze. The documentation officer, she said. At the documentation margin. Yes, he said, has been recording the ceremony with the professional, attending quality of someone doing the work correctly, she said. Yes, he said. And the work, she said, was the honest account of what the ceremony was. Yes, he said. Not the managed version, she said. No, he said. The documentation is the honest account. The managed version is insufficient for the archival record. She held his gaze with the complete, attending quality for a moment that had the specific, particular quality of something being assembled, not by the managing intelligence of someone constructing the correct framework for a formal occasion, but by the attending quality's genuine, honest reception of what was in front of it. I have been in the working sessions, she said. Yes, he said. 4 weeks, she said. Yes, he said. The observational gallery, she said. Yes, he said. The attending quality has been receiving what the sessions produced, she said. Yes, he said. The resource allocation gap, she said. The honest account rather than the managed version. Yes, he said. The provisions are better than the opening positions, she said, because the work was the honest account. Yes, he said. She was quiet for a moment. And now, she said, the documentation officer at the documentation margin. Yes, he said, with the notation stylus, she said. Yes, he said. In the function of the decade archiving assignment, she said. Yes, he said. She held his gaze. Who answered yes, she said. Yes, he said. Without hesitation, she said. Yes, he said. She received this with the attending quality, the complete, genuine reception of what she was looking at. The significant candidates, she said. The risk they would not take. The accurate reception, he said. Yes. The accurate reception, she said, of what? He thought about the honest answer. The specific, methodical thinking of someone who was in the choosing hall at the documentation margin, with the recording equipment running, and the notation system active, and who was, in the thinking, doing what he did when the situation required the honest account. The accurate reception, he said, of a declaration made by someone who meant it. She held his gaze. Meant it, she said. The significant candidates understood, he said, that the attending quality receives what it receives accurately. A declaration made in the correct performance register is received as correct performance. A declaration made because it is true is received as something true. He paused. The significant candidates determined that the difference between the two was the risk they would not take. And you, she said. I said yes, he said. Without hesitation, she said. Yes, he said. Because, she said. He held her gaze in the honest, attending mode. Because the honest account was yes, he said. The notation system has the pattern. The documentation records what occurred. 4 weeks of working sessions from the observational gallery with the attending quality fully present producing the honest account of what the sessions were. The honest account of what the sessions were is in the notation. He paused. The honest answer to the formal path's question is yes. Hesitation would have been the managed version. She was quiet for a long moment, the deep, attending quality of someone who was receiving something and who was letting the receiving be complete rather than processing it into the next managed step. The managed version, she said, is insufficient for the archival record, he said. She held his gaze with the attending quality, and in the attending quality there was the specific, particular thing that the choosing hall's assembled significance was witnessing. The complete, genuine reception of what was in front of her, directed at the documentation officer at the documentation margin who had said yes without hesitation, because the honest account was yes, and hesitation would have been the managed version. The choosing hall, she said, the assembled candidates. Yes, he said, the formal path sequence, she said. Yes, he said, the pattern, she said. In the notation, he said, and the documentation margin, she said. Yes, he said. Where the formal path ended, she said. Yes, he said. She looked at the choosing hall, the assembled significance of the formal ceremony, the candidates in their organized positions, the court's senior members, the noble house's representatives, the bilateral commission's attending officers. She looked at the notation system. She looked at the recording equipment. She looked at him. The archival reference, she said, the commission's decade archiving protocol. VC Sorvith Prime choosing decade 47, he said. The preliminary reference. The final reference will be assigned at filing. She received this. VC Sorvith Prime choosing decade 47, she said. Yes, he said. The documentation will include the formal path's conclusion, she said. Yes, he said. At the documentation margin, she said. Yes, he said. The answer, she said. Yes, he said. Without hesitation, she said. Yes, he said. She held his gaze for the long, specific moment of someone who had been in the choosing hall's formal right, and who had walked the formal path, and who had arrived at the documentation margin and asked the question, and received the answer, and who was, in the receiving, present to what the answer was. She said, in the ancient register, the formal acknowledgement of the Vaeylen choosing's right at its completion. The one before me is the one I have been walking toward. The choosing is complete. The choosing hall received this in the specific, collective quality of a significant ceremony that had arrived at its formal conclusion. Not the conclusion the assembled candidates had anticipated. Not the conclusion the noble house's organized positions had communicated as the expected outcome, but the conclusion that the formal path had produced in the specific, honest way of things that arrived where they arrived, because the attending quality received what it received accurately rather than what the formal performance suggested it should receive. The court's assembled significance was quiet. Queen Vaelindra, present at the choosing hall's sovereign position, received the formal acknowledgement with the attending quality, the complete, genuine reception of what the rite had produced. She held it for the moment of someone who was receiving something that was outside the expected outcome, and who was, in the receiving, finding that the outside expected quality was the quality of something true rather than something wrong. She looked at the documentation margin. She looked at her daughter. Her daughter had the attending quality directed at the documentation officer with the full, undistributed quality of the attending mode, the complete, genuine reception of what was in front of her, which was the person who had answered without hesitation because the honest account was yes. The Queen held this for a long moment in the attending quality. She said, in the formal register of the sovereign's acknowledgement, "The choosing is witnessed." Court advisor Vaeylen executed the formal acknowledgements protocol with the professional efficiency of someone whose ceremonial management competence was, in the current moment, applied to an outcome that was outside the anticipated range, and that was being managed with the organized professionalism that the court's function required regardless of the range. He was at the documentation margin. The notation stylus was still in his hand. He noted in the notation system the formal path's conclusion. Vaeylen choosing formal right, path conclusion, documentation margin, western position, answer received, choosing complete. He noted it with the flat, honest quality of the documentation function, what occurred in the order it occurred. He looked at the recording equipment. The equipment was running. The archival record was complete. She was looking at him. He looked at her. "The notation," he said. "Yes," she said. "We'll need the supplementary documentation," he said. "The formal path's conclusion at the documentation margin is outside the standard notation categories. The archival reference will require a supplementary notation." She held his gaze. "What supplementary notation?" she said. He thought about the honest account. "The pattern," he said, "the significant candidates. The accurate reception they determined was the risk they would not take." He paused. "The documentation margin, the formal path's ending, the answer without hesitation." She received this. "The supplementary notation," she said, "is the honest account of what the documentation recorded." "Yes," he said, "which is different from the managed version," she said. "The managed version is insufficient for the archival record," he said. She held his gaze with the attending quality, the full, undistributed reception of what was in front of her. "The supplementary notation's reference," she said. "VC Sorvith Prime choosing decade 47 S1, he said. "S1, she said. "First supplementary notation," he said. "The standard archival format." "The first," she said. "Yes," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "How many supplementary notations will there be?" she said. He held her gaze in the honest, attending mode. "The honest account requires as many as the honest account produces," he said. She held his gaze for the specific, particular moment of the attending quality receiving what it received, the full, complete reception of something that was true before it was said, and that the saying confirmed rather than produced. "The Commission's standard archival timeline," she said, 60 days. "Yes," he said. "For the primary documentation," she said. "Yes," he said. "The supplementary notations," she said, "are filed with the primary